Thank you for being here. Why did you choose journalism as a career, and were you always interested in it?
A bit like you, actually. I was interested in journalism when I was a school student, and we set up a very bad version of Private Eye, the British satirical magazine at school, in which we said things about teachers and other members of the school that we probably shouldn't have done, actually, but we had a good time. So I did that. And I was always fascinated in journalism. I was lucky in the sense that my best friend's dad did the job I now do. So he was a presenter on the radio in the mornings, quite a famous guy, and my parents weren't involved in journalism or in politics, but I looked at this guy and thought, that looks like a really interesting job. And now I never for a second dreamt I'd actually do it, but I've ended up doing the same job as my best friend's dad.
Okay. You talked about this in the talk for a bit, but journalists, especially in the UK, suffer a lot of abuse, and you're no exception, especially on platforms like Twitter. How do you deal with it?
Not only am I not an exception, I think I'm the rule. In other words, I think I get more abuse than most. The woman, Laura Kuenssberg, who took over from me as BBC political editor, gets probably even more. And I think young women in particular get worse abuse and more offensive abuse online than blokes tend to. I think in the end, you have to put it in its perspective and realise that if a guy came up to you on the street and said he didn't like you, just shrug your shoulders and think, so what? So why should you care more that someone comes up to you on the kind of virtual street, which is what Twitter is. And it tends to be in Twitter. Actually, people are rather more civilised on Facebook than they are on Twitter. So you have to realise that A, that's one or two people, it doesn't matter. B, people feel passionately about things. And if people feel passionately about their leader or their party or their view, or that they're in favour of Brexit or against Brexit, of course they're going to get passionate about it. And if they think you're somehow stopping other people agreeing with them, so you have to be able to step back a bit. Occasionally what I do is take them on, but not being rude, being ridiculously polite. So sometimes I go, oh God, I'm really sorry you feel that way. I was just trying to, and then a lot of the people just back off. Because the whole thing about social media is because it's on our phone or our tablet handset. You often do it before you've had time to think, And so people just do this in a rage. Off it goes. And when somebody then goes, God, you really hate me that much? It's like, no, I didn't really mean it. So yeah, you have to get some perspective about it.
You wrote an article for The Guardian arguing that the BBC need to stop silencing dissenting and fringe voices and give them more airtime. Don't you think that this means that you're giving undue validation to extreme points of view sometimes?
No, actually. I think that the BBC didn't ever silence people, but the BBC has a slight tendency to go with the conventional wisdom, to take the view that everybody in inverted commas now thinks A or B. And I think it is a good thing to do, to say, well, let's find the person who doesn't agree with that. Let's find the person who's challenging that. Because so many ideas that your generation now take for granted were the result of a struggle. So gay rights, let's take gay rights. I imagine at this school you would virtually find no one, other than on real religious grounds, who had a problem. And there would be people who had problems on religious grounds. But that sort of liberal view of homosexuality was unthinkable 30 years ago. But it would have been right 30 years ago to hear the person who thought you should have gay rights. Equally now, we should hear from the person who doesn't think you should have gay rights. We should hear from the passionate Christian or Muslim or anybody else who says, you know what, this just doesn't fit with my view of the world and with my view of God. We should hear those people without thinking that somehow we're endangered by hearing them. You're never endangered by hearing someone you disagree with. Actually, it may just help you understand why you disagree with them.
But when you look at debates like the climate change debate, where there's a scientific consensus, and then don't you think it's problematic that the BBC then challenges that?
Well, I don't think the BBC does challenge the scientific consensus. What we do is say that even if it is true that climate change is predominantly man-made, which is the scientific consensus, even if it's true, there is a legitimate debate after that about what you do. So there are people like, there's a guy called Nigel Lawson, who used to be Chancellor of the Exchequer, the finance minister in the UK, who would say, even if it's true, he happens to think it isn't true, but even if it is true, spending that much money on trying to counter climate change is a complete waste of money, and you could spend that money better on many of the other priorities people might share, whether it's poverty relief, whether it's improving the environment in the sense of how it looks. Now that's a legitimate debate. We should have that debate. What clearly we don't want to do is have people on lying, presenting things as truth. Now in one case, Nigel Lawson did say something on air about climate change that wasn't accurate. But what happened? We had an investigation. We said it was a mistake. We apologised for the mistake. He won't be allowed to say it again. So, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't have a debate. You should always have a debate.
Some print magazines and newspapers in the UK are notoriously biased. Do you think that the TV impartiality laws that are imposed on televised media should also be imposed on print media in the UK?
No. I think it kind of works in the UK to have this very robust, very aggressive, very partisan print media, and now online media as well. And the print media is predominantly to the right, not exclusively, but predominantly to the right. And online media, the most successful, is tending to be, I think probably as a result, a counterbalance on the left. It makes sense to have that and then to keep broadcast news impartial. Now, of course, you could go down the route of saying, well, why should TV and radio be any different from print? And after all, on your iPad or on your tablet, broadcasting isn't any different from print in the sense of some has text and some has video and some has audio and so on. But I think the argument for it is this: look at what's happening in America. Do you want a situation where right-wing people watch Fox News and liberal left-wing people watch MSNBC, so that when you then have a debate on a subject like healthcare, there are no shared facts? They can't have a debate. They don't even agree what the problem is. In the UK, I think, in large parts of Europe, people have an agreement roughly what the statistical basis of a problem is. Here's what we spend, this is what it does do, and this is what and then they have an argument about what the right solution is. But if you have partisan broadcast media, you don't even get told the basics.
Some questions about Brexit and the EU negotiations.
On which, of course, I have no views.
In what ways do you think the UK's relationship with the EU will develop over the next 10 years?
God, if I knew that, I'd be a very rich man. I mean, we just don't know, do we? I mean, what's so striking about Brexit is unlike someone forming a government, or unlike, for example, the people calling for Scottish independence in the referendum that was held in 2014, there was no organisation or manifesto for getting out of the EU. Somebody described it as like a pop-up campaign. These guys got together for the campaign, said a few things, and then disappeared again. And they don't exist. You can't even say, hold on, you said this, because those people have moved, and some of them are in government, other people have left. It's not the same. So the truth is, we simply don't know the nature of the relationship between the UK and the EU in future years, and that's why it's very unnerving for people, because it's a fundamental part of what keeps business operating, and it's critical, particularly for your generation, who've taken for granted the ability to work and study and travel easily. Now, it may well be that you can have Brexit and still do all those things. You know, just down the road is Switzerland. They're not in the EU. They are able to, young people from Switzerland are able to have a relationship pretty much as if they were in the EU. But we don't know whether Britain will do the same.
Okay. Secondly, do you think that British politicians need to more seriously consider the possibility of a no-deal Brexit?
I think they are considering it. I think no deal's a real possibility, and I think gradually both sides, those in favour of Brexit and those against Brexit, are thinking about no deal. I'm not sure the public understands what no deal means. I don't think the public often realise that everything from your ability to get on a plane flying from one bit to the EU to another, to goods coming across a border, to the ability to study and be part of that Erasmus programme, all those things are a result of deals of some sort. Now, I actually think it's very unlikely there'll be absolutely no deal at all. What there might be is a whole series of little deals, which deal with flying planes and deal with Erasmus and deal with this and that, but there isn't a big strategic trade deal, in which case that's going to be quite a shock.
Again, you talked about this in the talk, but the public is increasingly getting more and more information from social media. How do you think that organisations like BBC should change the way they work to adapt to the changing media landscape?
Well, the BBC uses social media a lot. I have a big Twitter following that. We use Facebook a lot, etc., etc. So we're ahead. We're always trying to keep up with, what social media is being used. The difficulty is if people think that the way you get news is from one of these social media platforms without taking any interest in who put the stuff there in the first place. So if you say, as some people I think did during the EU referendum, I get my news from Facebook, I get my news from Snapchat, or I get my news from Instagram, whatever it is, Twitter. The point is that's like saying I get my news from paper in the old days. I mean, yeah, that's what carries the news. That doesn't tell you who wrote it, why did they write it, why didn't they write something else? Have they got a financial interest or a political interest? What are they about? Can you trust them? Have they got a record that means that they've in the past made lots of mistakes? And I think the thing that we all have to learn about social media is we've got to ask more questions about where things come from, who's doing them and why, just in the way that we would about buying a mobile phone. We wouldn't just say, oh, I'm going to buy one. Take the first thing that came across our desk. And we have to realise that the way social media operates is deliberately addictive. It is, algorithms are designed to make people addicted to being liked or to being shared. And what is in the interests of the wider population is not being liked and being shared. It's actually thinking about things. Being liked and being shared means that news, as I said at the talk, is reduced to a three-letter word. It's either OMG, LOL, or WTF. And none of those things are actually a good way of making decisions about very complicated problems.
In what ways do you think Facebook should change the way it operates too?
I literally don't know enough about the way Facebook's algorithms work, but it's clear to me that social media companies, Facebook, Twitter, Google, have behaved as if it's just this stuff that happens on our platform. It's nothing to do with us. We're not publishers. We're just a platform. It's just where things happen. That's not going to wash anymore. In the end, people want regulation to deal with things that provoke terrorism. They want regulation to deal with child pornography or child abuse. And I think they will increasingly say, we want some form of regulation and control that makes for a kind of more civilized debate and doesn't allow people to reach us who are interested merely in provoking rage and fury.
Okay. Finally, what advice would you give to young people who are thinking of pursuing journalism as a career now?
You've got to be very flexible. Nobody can predict what journalism will look like in 20 years' time. I mean, when I began as a journalist, people thought the BBC would be out of date by the time I'm the age I am now. So it shows that often people are wrong in their predictions about the future. Often new technology comes and sits alongside old technology rather than replacing it. But the main thing you have to be as a journalist is think it's really about content. If you think that because you can use a camera, or because you can use a laptop, or because you can edit, or because this makes you a good journalist, none of that. It's about content. Those are all valuable, skills to learn. But really what makes a journalist is someone who asks difficult questions, who finds things out, who makes contacts, and who writes well or broadcasts well in a way that engages people's interests. That's what makes a good journalist. And I think there's a danger that people think what makes a good journalist is being able to use your laptop cleverly, and it isn't.